Information about the competition, go to our website, studentcam.org.
Now a look at the fight against ISIS. Middle East experts talk about how the terrorist group is responding to recent attacks in Mosul and the challenges facing other parts of Iraq that were once under ISIS control. From the Atlantic Council, this is an hour and 20 minutes.
I want to first introduce our panelists before I begin to give a lay of the land and signpost our conversation today. Sitting to my immediate left, your right, is Hassan Hassan. He's a resident at the Tahrir Institute and the co-author of ISIS Inside the Army of Terror. And next to Hassan on the left is Jessica Lewis McFate, who is the director of Tradecraft Innovation at the Institute for the Study of War. And also on the far left, the far end of the panel, is Howard Shatz. He's a senior economist at the RAND Corporation, whose latest ISIS-related publication is called Foundations of the Islamic State. And we're going to, rather than have sort of set prepared speeches today, we're going to have this more of a discussion format about current related events related to the Islamic State, but also building upon that, a lot of the history, its foundations, where it came from, and then what we can learn from that for perhaps future policy options for the next American administration as we come on after the election. So I think it's actually best to start with both Hassan and Jessica as we look forward, as we start here. Obviously, in the news, we have the battle for Mosul going on. It began, I believe, about 2 weeks ago, for me personally, it's going faster than I thought. It seems to be going pretty well, but I am not an expert on sort of these type of topics. So I'd like to start with you. I mean, how would you judge the current battle, and what do you think it portends about the current war against the Islamic State?
Well, I think this is, Iraqis recognize this is the most important offensive against, not only against the Islamic State, but an offensive, conducted by Iraqis. President Barzani, for example, described, he told Iraqi officials in Baghdad that this is the first time that Iraqis and the Kurds, Kurdish Peshmerga, fighting on the same side for probably 60 years. So it's a very important offensive, and it's I think so far it's been going very impressively, very well. It's going certainly on schedule. This is the second day Iraqi forces are inside Mosul. They are the outskirts of Mosul. I think so far it's going very well. The composition of the forces that are supposed to go inside Mosul are the right forces. They are professional Iraqi forces, the counterterrorism force, and the federal police with tribal fighters from Nainawa and Sunni fighters. So I think so far there's cause for optimism. There are problems we can discuss when we, in the conversation later on. There are fault lines. There are problems that are starting to appear and emerge in the first few weeks. This is the third week of the campaign.
Certainly. Well, I'd just like to echo first that the coalition that is attacking ISIS in Mosul is impressive. ISIS is expert at trying to exploit seams among enemy coalitions, and this coalition is going to outlast ISIS's efforts. I do think they're going to take the city center. I think one of the challenges that we're going to face is that there are neighborhoods in Mosul from which AQI, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, ISIS's predecessor, was likely never cleared. So the clearing operation for the full extent of the city is a measure of success beyond taking the government buildings and the base back. ISIS's defensives have been formed in rings. When forces began to approach Mosul on the south, the east, and the north of the city, they ran into some defenses. On some axes, 95 VBIDs. So one of the measures of success in defeating ISIS's defenses is to interdict, let's say, 90% of those VBIDs. But one of the challenges is that that still means that 10 VBIDs get through, Those are very elaborate car bombs that inflict a lot of damage, killing a number of the forces that are on advance. So the casualties for coalition forces on the advance are still very high because the volume of ISIS's defensive measures are intense. ISIS has blocked roads, we're uncovering tunnels. The momentum of the offensive is very impressive despite these obstacles. I do expect that ISIS is also expert in urban warfare and that they have also prepared the city to be a very long and protracted fight. But I also agree that while their defenses are excellent, the offensive is better. And Mosul will be cleared, but there will, of course, be challenges not only around Nineveh, where other spoilers such as Iranian-backed Shia militias, Asayib al-Haq, are trying to take key terrain such as Tel Afar on the west side of Mosul, which can induce a number of sectarian and ethnic challenges, not only at a local level, but at a regional one. But also ISIS's counteroffensive measures that are occurring elsewhere in Iraq. ISIS led a counteroffensive in Kirkuk, in Sinjar, in Rutba. ISIS is still executing its standard explosives campaign inside of Baghdad. There have been anomalous attacks, not only in the vicinity of Tikrit, but in Diyala over the course of the preceding month. So there are places throughout ISIS's depth within Iraq where I expect we will see ISIS try to divert attention and try to achieve some gains that not only counteract the tactical and operational advances towards Mosul, but the message that the coalition is going to achieve durable gains.
Yeah, and Howard, I think this is a good place for you to jump into the conversation here because Jessica brought up ISIS's predecessor organization, and I think for most people in this room, it's not a secret that we've seen this movie before: a building offensive for Mosul against a protracted insurgency based inside the city and efforts to clear it. I mean, can you talk a little bit about the origins of this particular threat, the Islamic State, its bureaucratic structures in this area, and why why Nineveh in particular is such an interesting case study about the group itself and its predecessors?
Sure. The Islamic State grew out originally of a group, Jamaat Tawhid wal Jihad, founded by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi from Jordan. Zarqawi moved into Iraq before the United States led an international coalition invading Iraq. And then he formed a group that in 2004 swore allegiance to al-Qaeda, and they became known in English as al-Qaeda in Iraq. Now, if we go back to the 2004-2006 period, the center of their power was really Anbar province. And even there, they had already organized into an effective bureaucracy. The bureaucracy was built on the model of al-Qaeda, but then it was changed a bit to really be designed to take and hold territory. So what we saw in Anbar in 2004 to 2006 was the province was divided into 6 al-Qaeda in Iraq sectors. Each of those sectors had a leader, an emir, had a well-defined bureaucracy, an administrative emir, a military emir, other positions like that. And there was coordination between the center and the different sectors. So the sectors would raise money and send money up to the center, the headquarters of Anbar province. Anbar province would reallocate that money and send it down. Each of the sectors was fundraising on its own and had operational autonomy. Now, even at that period, the Anbar province was sending money up to the Iraq level. All right. So 2006, Zarqawi was killed, and 2 new leaders took over, Abu Ayyab al-Masri and Abu Omar al-Baghdadi. And just to give you a sense, we're going to be talking about Iraq after ISIS and Syria after ISIS. I mean, we're looking forward, so there's great uncertainty. So just to give you a sense, in 2006, 2007, 2008, what was the uncertainty? The big uncertainty was we didn't even know if Abu Omar al-Baghdadi existed and who was in charge. It was assumed that Abu Ayyab al-Masri was in charge. Right? But we have the surge. The surge started late 2006. Actually, the actual surge started 2007. But the Sahwa, the uprising, the pushback by the Sunni forces in Anbar started in 2006. And we then see the violence migrating through Iraq. Anbar, the peak of violence was around October 2006. It goes to Diyala and Salahuddin And the peak of violence there is sometime in June 2007. And it migrates finally up to Mosul, which is a key node for bringing foreign fighters in and for raising money. And the peak of combat violence in Mosul was early 2008, I believe. Right. So that's the first element of the importance of Mosul. The second part of the importance of Mosul was in the 2008-2010 period, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, renamed Islamic State of Iraq in 2006, never went away. So they had sleeper cells all around the country. And there was, again, the same kind of financing that I talked about. The local areas would send their money up to Mosul, send 20% up. Mosul would reallocate. Right? And at that time, 2008, certainly, Mosul and the desert areas south of Mosul, the Jazeera, were the only net plus areas in terms of fundraising. So very important in terms of fundraising. Where did that fundraising come from? It came from skimming contracts, reconstruction contracts, which, to fast forward, is something we should be concerned about going on. It came from shaking down a cell phone company. It came from oil sales, all the things we see today. So the other thing is that we knew that some of the leadership had sought refuge in the desert areas south of Mosul. Right? So they had cells in the cities, and then leadership was somewhat off the grid, both in terms of their records and in terms of location. The other element, when I said that there were sleeper cells all over, is when we look at the financial reallocations, we have a point in time, we have money coming up from Anbar, from Baghdad, from Salahuddin, from Diyala. We have money going out to those same places, money going down to Basra, and to this day, I don't know whether there was a cell in Basra or whether this was money going to Buka prison, the big prison camp in Basra Governor, and we have money going into Syria. So that's another thing to take account of, is this was, even at the time, a multinational group, rest and relaxation in Syria, fighters coming in through Syria. So that's where Mosul sits in kind of the importance for this group, and that hasn't really changed.
Yeah, and it's something that you all touched on sort of indirectly, and I'll bring it up here, is it's the battle for the city itself, seems from a military standpoint relatively straightforward, and people you talk to say it's hard to defend. But the difficult part will be the road that leads out, the one that leads through, I guess, out into Syria. And so can you, and this is also where you run into some of those problems, I think, that you were alluding to, but I'm gonna put my finger on it. So let's open it up to all three. So what are the problems you see, particularly around Tal Afar? You both brought it up. And the importance to that road, maybe historically for the Islamic State. Howard, if you want to jump in at the end, and all three can address.
It's a good way to start to talk about the bad things happening in Mosul. I remember back when the offensive in Fallujah was taking place, I was saying that Mosul is going to be a much bigger problem, not because it's a big city, not because it's a military challenge, but also because it's a political it's a political flashpoint. It's a potential political flashpoint. At the time, many people were saying, no, Mosul is going to be actually easier than Fallujah, because for a long time, Fallujah was a problem for Iraq, whether during the Saddam Hussein regime or during the when the Americans were there. They resisted any political order in Baghdad. They didn't want to be dominated, and so on and so forth. But Mosul is a problem for many reasons. One is that, and I think we've reached a point in the fight against ISIS in both Iraq and Syria, and we're going to get into Syria in a little bit, where politics matters more than the military challenge against ISIS. And Mosul is a perfect example, because there are so many stakeholders are involved in Mosul. Many people want a piece of the pie in Mosul. Unlike Fallujah, Fallujah was a military challenge, probably also a political challenge, but was more of a political challenge than a military one. It was up to the Iraqi government and the Americans to sort out what's the best formula in Fallujah. But in Mosul, it's not up to the Iraqi government, it's not up to the Americans to sort out what's best there. There are the Kurds involved there. There are different Kurds involved in there. The KRG, the Kurdish region government, doesn't have the support of everyone inside Kurdistan to back certain political agendas in Mosul. For example, you're an expert on this. The Turkish involvement inside Iraq is a good example, because while President Barzani supported the involvement in one way or another, other political oppositionists within Kurdistan opposed it. And you have also the PKK. Is a major concern for Turkey near Tel Afar. Someone mentioned Tel Afar is a very problematic area, and it's going to be a big flashpoint. It's northwest of Mosul. It's a Turkmen-dominated area. Turkey said that the Shia militia should not be there, but really the Turks are also more concerned about the PKK rise in Sinjar near Tel Afar. So Mosul is really, I think, the Americans stitched some of these fault lines for now, and things are going very well for now. But I think ISIS will try to destroy the current strategy, which is actually very promising, by trying to fight in Mosul for, say, 4 months. And if it does that, I think many of these alliances will collapse. There are already signs of tension between different factions fighting outside Mosul, and I think these tensions will increase, will intensify, and we will see in a few months that the situation on the ground is going to be completely different. I think ISIS will be able to hold on to the city for quite a while. I think there has been a lot of wishful thinking about the city collapsing somehow, that ISIS members will choose to go to Raqqa. That's why we have confused reporting coming from out of Washington. Some say fighters coming from Raqqa into Mosul, and some say fighters are actually moving from Mosul outside. So these fault lines are ethnic, sectarian, geopolitical, and I think these will emerge and become even more intense in the coming weeks and months.
Anything to pick up on that, Jessica?
Well, just to agree that the longer the battle for Mosul goes, the more vulnerable the coalition will become. The broader the operation becomes, with follow-on operations, for example, in Tel Afar, or supporting operations in the Zab, the more diffuse the operation will become as well, which also leaves room for coalition members to become delinked. The road from Mosul to Tel Afar to Sinjar to Syria is perhaps more important for members of the coalition who have disparate interests in those places than it is for ISIS tactically. The Jazeera Desert that is beneath that road to the south and southwest of Mosul is traversable. We are, of course, entering the winter season, which makes it slightly less so, but the winter season also makes the biggest constraint upon ISIS's movement in the Jazeera, our air cover, constrained from visibility as well. So there are ways for ISIS to escape this operation and reset elsewhere. But I would also say that ISIS has been preparing for the battle for Mosul for a very long time, and that its troop movements and preparation for the battle have probably already occurred. So we're going to see other responses from ISIS, as I mentioned before, elsewhere in Iraq, where it has established positions already. If I may just add one other point, and perhaps just to mention it now, and we can discuss it more perhaps during question and answer. There are other threats that stem from the grievances of Sunni Arabs in Nineveh and elsewhere in Iraq that could also produce spoilers to the coalition if the grievances are not addressed, which they're not likely to be addressed quickly. There are other elements who are seeking to be champions of Iraq's Sunni population. Not only the neo-Ba'athist organization, Jaish Tariq al-Naqshbandiya, that was trying to capture the national Sunni protest movement before ISIS decided to come in and start controlling cities in 2014, but also Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda in Syria The affiliate Jabhat al-Nusra, which has reflagged itself as Jaish Fatah al-Sham, is already conducting outreach to tribes in Anbar. Al-Qaeda is going to make a play to become a silent vanguard of a Sunni insurgency in Iraq. And if the grievances are not addressed, the vulnerability will remain open. And in the vacuum of control by ISIS, you could see mobilization of Sunnis under a different flag. So to put that on the list of challenges that we need to make sure we're thinking about and facing.
Anything to add, perhaps, maybe the role, is it fit into, as you mentioned in your intro, about both its economic importance to the transnational movement of the group and maybe efforts of the coalition to attack that at the moment? Are they putting pressure on it, and do you see that as linked into the broader struggle now with our current focus on Mosul?
You're talking about the Iraq-Syria link.
The link.
Yeah. So a couple things. So I think this is actually very important to think about movement being possible through the desert, through the Jazeera, because we're going to see movement back and forth. We've seen. Let me credit the citations, and I think as I talk, you should just assume that I'm probably citing somewhere Hassan and Jessica and Aaron without saying it. So we might end up, kind of doing a circular citation at some point. But I want to cite very good work by Iraq Oil Report now, which is showing Islamic State fighters leaving the city, going towards Syria. So stopping those routes, or at least being able to track those fighters, is going to be important. The Islamic State is very cognizant of issues of air cover. As far back as 2007, 2008, we have a strategy document from them where they talked specifically of what to do to of how effective coalition air forces were, of how they were able to move soldiers, and what the group should do to stop air forces from seeing their operations. So they are, whatever they do, they're going to be quite cognizant of that. Those routes have been historically important, moving people. The real first very strong evidence we had of how predecessor groups moved their fighters were known as the Sinjar documents. This was a cache of documents discovered in Sinjar detailing the borders emirate and fighter flows in and out. The other issue about this area, Tel Afar, I don't know how much symbolic importance it has now. Tel Afar was one of the first battlefields where the U.S. really tested and succeeded at a counterinsurgency fight against ISIS. And Tel Afar is where many of the some of the current Islamic State leaders come from. So, it's going to be a bit of a flashpoint. And as Hassan said, and Jessica said, the Shia PMUs coming in, right? They're very diverse. I don't want to characterize them as all one way or another. It's always a mistake to group the PMUs as one mass. But how they handle the civilians, how much of a fight Islamic State decides to put up is going to be very important.
And just to pick up on some of my own work, my work focuses mainly on the Islamic State's network in Turkey. And both Tel Afar and Sinjar and that road leading through, we conceptualize it here, and I think most people do, as the Turkish problem with ISIS emerged late because it was the primary transit route for foreign fighters that came in to the current conflict, and by that beginning in, say, 2014. But if you look back historically and begin to document foreign fighter flows, obviously Syria was the main entry point into Iraq, but you had to get to Syria. And so one of the ways through was exactly the routes that are now being leveraged, although less so, which is to move through southeastern Turkey, to smuggle yourself across the border and to go across. And so this brings us back into how ISIS should not be thought of as simply, and it's a lot of Howard's work as well, and both Hassan and Jessica, as a sort of boots-on-the-ground military force that can be beaten back, but it has these tentacles of bureaucracies that have outlasted or outlived significant pressure being put upon them, and they extend out into the region. And I think it's a good segue to, it's not just a battle in Mosul and Tel Afar on the road. That road stops someplace, and in this town in Washington, there's a lot of talk now of putting simultaneous pressure on the Islamic State. So we have the pressure being put on Mosul. And so the logical other endpoint to put pressure on them at the same point is to go after Raqqa. But a lot of, and I would say, whereas the coalition in Iraq is stitched together, and I would say it's stitched together pretty well, the Syrian case provides a lot of, Syrian case provides a lot of complications because the primary force poised to go are something we call here the Syrian Democratic Forces, let's say the majority of which are they call themselves the Democratic Union Party, the PYD, who have a militia, the YPG, Kurdish alphabet soup, who are primarily Kurds, who are poised to go, there are suggestions that they could go, and this raises those same ethnic tensions that ISIS feeds on. Intra-Kurdish, intra-Arab, Arab-Kurdish tensions at this other flashpoint now of Raqqa.
I mean, this is going to be a big problem in Raqqa. For a long time, I think it was recognized that ISIS presence in Syria is much shallower than the one in Iraq. There is a legacy in Iraq. There are alternatives in Syria to ISIS, insurgent, Sunni insurgent groups. That's why I think Raqqa is going to be I mean, the challenge in Raqqa is going to be different. It's not again, it's not a military challenge. Just like I said earlier, the challenge in the fight against ISIS today is really concentrated in the northern parts of both Iraq and Syria. Raqqa, there is, and I feel this time and again here in Washington, they underestimate how much not hated, but feared and suspected their suspicion about the Kurdish force inside Syria when it comes to the Syrian rebels, to the local populations there. This is because the Syrian Democratic Forces, and here we're talking really about the YPG rather than the Arab components within the SDF, that there's a perception that these guys they want to dominate in northern Syria, and they want to cleanse and kind of populate some of these areas to put back some of the Kurdish families that were displaced back in the 70s by the Ba'ath party in Syria. So there's this fear that they have an agenda, and this agenda is directly involving the population in there. There's I think Washington politicians here underplay that, and they say, you know, let's deal with ISIS, let's expel ISIS from Raqqa, and then we will deal with the political mess afterwards. And we promise you that the Kurds will leave Raqqa; they're not going to stay in Raqqa. This is the kind of the cliche here. And for a long time, I think until recently, until probably the past 1 month or 2 months. There was a debate about really, are there alternatives? Can we work with someone else other than the SDF? But recently, I think because the current administration is running out of time, they are becoming more unequivocal about who's going to go there. They want the Kurds to go there, and this is going to be a problem because we know that if Raqqa is retaken by the Kurds, even if ISIS is expelled from there, and there's good news in that in and of itself, I think the sentiments, the local sentiments, is going to be seized by Al-Qaeda and other extremist forces who are local. Many of them, many fighters who are fighting now in Aleppo and Idlib and even southern Syria, who are affiliated to extremist forces, they were driven by ISIS from Raqqa, from Deir ez-Zor, from Hasaka. These guys are going to go back, and there's a concern about a void that they will exploit, and that void is going to be the Kurdish Arab tension. I think that's a big selling point for them, and they're already kind of utilizing that to say the Kurds have an agenda, a separatist agenda, and they have also an ethnic cleansing agenda there. So I think Raqqa is going to be a problem in that sense, and I don't think there are Arab forces, on the other hand, who are capable of going into Raqqa. So there is a dilemma. Do you delay Raqqa so much that ISIS will entrench itself there and delay its and kind of go past the momentum in Mosul, or you rush into Raqqa by sending these YPG forces in there?
Maybe you want to pick up on that dilemma too, because I think that's an important thing to put your finger on. Is I think that there's a recognition that it's problematic ethnically and perhaps longer term politically, but there's an inherent desire to keep up the offensive because ISIS is, from a political standpoint here and a military standpoint, you want to oust them as quickly as possible so they can't congregate and plan attacks against the West.
Wonderful. I'm going to quickly echo two of Hassan's points and then speak to that dilemma. The first, about the Kurdish-Arab dynamic inside of Syria. I want to give an example of how this has played out before. When the SDF, in conjunction with our coalition, drove ISIS out of Shadadi in 2015. That's a town that is sort of between Mosul and Raqqa, just on the Syrian side of the border. The Sunni Arab population in Shadadi fled south into ISIS-held territory in Deir ez-Zor province. That's how they felt about the idea of being liberated by a predominantly Kurdish force. That dynamic is still a vulnerability and a risk when it comes to the Raqqa operation. It's one of the reasons why the dilemma exists. On the other side, it is not only the concern about the lack of capacity of Turkish-backed opposition forces who also want to go to Raqqa largely to head off a Kurdish liberation operation, but it's also the fact that al-Qaeda is a part of that coalition of opposition groups. So to have al-Qaeda-linked groups take Raqqa from ISIS is to enable al-Qaeda. To me, the reason why the dilemma is becoming so complicated and so sharp inside Syria is because a lot of our options to deal with ISIS in the context of so many sectarian and ethnic fault lines and seams that have played out so violently over the course of these last years in Syria is the fact that our anti-ISIS policy does not address al-Qaeda. So if it doesn't block al-Qaeda, it enables al-Qaeda, which leaves us in a dilemma.
Howard, anything to add?
Yeah, I'll take this dilemma and I'll try to double it. So with Islamic State, it's always a good idea to take territory from them. And it's always a good idea to do it right, however. Why is it a good idea to take territory from them? Because even though much of our focus on their fundraising is about oil, current estimates coming mid-year from the U.S. Treasury, which is our most credible source at this point, are that they're actually getting higher levels of revenue from taxation and extortion. And that takes place with population centers. So, they have all manner of fines. You would be fined for not having the right beard. You would be fined for wearing your pants below your ankle. You would be charged for a parking space. All this diversified ways to raise money. If you have a city like Raqqa, 150 to 300,000 people, we don't have a current census. All of a sudden, those are people who can pay fines and fees and help the group raise money. So you want to always reduce their territory. The difficulty, as my colleague said, is who actually does that. And here I'm going to divide this into two stages. One is who does the liberating, and then who does the holding. So 2 stages. Now, the Kurds, the YPG forces, or the SDF, so largely Kurds, some Arabs, are probably best placed militarily to do that liberating right now. That's the calculation of the coalition. They're not the best placed, as we've said, to do the holding because of ethnic issues. The other thing that makes it a little more complicated is, I think, that the Syrian Kurds really have no interest in staying in Raqqa. It's not their historic territory. They weren't displaced from there. It's too far south. They do want to hold Kurdish territory. They've already deemed an autonomous administration. And so that, if they don't want to hold it, but they are the liberating force, that leads to the next question of what's the bargain, right? What are they going to demand in turn, or what can we, the U.S. and others, force upon them to leave if we can push them to leave? And part of that bargain is going to have to be agreement with Turkey, primarily with Turkey, who has the biggest concern about them. So there are going to be all these issues that enter into Raqqa liberation.
Right, and I'll pick up here and add, you had this Turkish intervention across the border, Operation Euphrates Shield, and it's succeeded in what I would call its primary objective, which was to push ISIS off of the border. And in doing so, some of the things that we've been talking about indirectly, and I addressed directly in my previous comments, was it blocked, it really blocked the foreign fighter entry points into Syria any longer. And so there are really no areas in which somebody wanting to join ISIS can get into Syria any longer. Certainly there are ways they can get in, they can pay smuggling, but it's not anything like it was when I was living there in 2013 and slightly after that. But it raises a whole other host of problems. So I'm going to double down on the problems, and I promise we will give the audience something hopeful at the end before we turn to questions. And that is, and it's like another flashpoint. It's a town called Al-Bab, which now is ISIS held, but sits about 10 to 15 kilometers from regime territory, which is south. It's on either side of the Kurds hold either side, and anywhere from 15 to 25 kilometers, depending on the day. And then now you have Turkish-backed forces above it, about 20 kilometers. And so they can converge here. And so all of the threads of the disparate war inside of Syria can come together with any means of escalation. Turkey-Syria, Turkey-Russia, presuming, that could be managed. But more importantly, on those ethnic cleavages that ISIS preys upon, you now have a race between Kurds and Turks, more or less, for a town that ISIS is now holding. And so I'm going to ask an extremely provocative question before we move to the positive and uplifting note of policy recommendations. And then before questions, the most important part of the presentation. Al-Bab, I would argue, and I'm going to sound insane, ISIS is a stabilizing force at the moment. And so do we actually have an incentive to try and stave off the type of intra-ethnic insurgency that would come after ISIS by trying to focus on the political challenges of Raqqa first?
It's a tough question because Al-Bab is a tough territory. It's one of the areas where some locals were involved in the jihad in Iraq. So there are some routes for ISIS in the area. It's going to be much tougher than elsewhere. We thought Manbij is going to be tough, and it was tough. It cost the Kurdish forces one of the highest kind of casualty after Kobani. Al-Bab is going to be a whole different level, and there is that different forces at the outskirts, and they want to go in or don't want to, because I think some secretly want the regime to go into Al-Bab because that will save the Americans a lot of blood and treasure, and also will save not American blood, but forces backed by the Americans. And Turkey, I would, and there's no evidence to this, but I can imagine the Turks would like the regime to take Al-Bab, because that would be a buffer between the Kurds and their different cantons in Aleppo or in Raqqa. So nobody has an answer to that, and I think the Syrian rebels do not have the capacity to go there. If the Kurds go there, it's going to cost them a lot of blood and treasure as well.
And distract from Raqqa.
It's going to be a protracted war, and it's a difficult terrain.
All right. And maybe that?
Just the broader point that the dynamics of the Syrian war are independent of ISIS. ISIS drew strength from that conflict. So, to me, your question about Al-Bab is a microcosm of a bigger question, and that is, can you defeat ISIS while the Syrian war is still raging? Which does, by all means, draw in not just neighboring states, but regional states, and put them in conflict such that the movement of tactical engagements can stoke regional volatility. So it's a great question. I would not wish to call ISIS a stabilizing force.
Said it was provocative.
But I do think I do also think that it is possible to design operations and campaigns with it as a necessary condition that the hold force will neither be X or Y. It will be something else that will perpetuate a stable moment. Now, the hold force that has taken hold throughout many of the places that have been reclaimed from ISIS in Iraq have not necessarily met that criterion. So the hold force is perhaps the key element of the campaign, such that getting to claim a victory tactically against ISIS, taking back a small town or a very large city, is going to stick to the tune of ISIS not having a chance to come back.
And you want to pick up on anything? I mean, well, so here's, this is great in diagnosing problems, but if you can't treat the problems, what point is it having everybody come here and listen to us speak? So, it's an immense challenge, and we talked a little bit about the inherent conflicts of needing to push them out of territory in order to decrease their revenue base, but also to disrupt their plots potentially against the West, which is what we care about most here. And so, how would you treat these two conflicts? What policy recommendations would you put in place, for the next administration, whether it be Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton?
Iraq and Syria?
Iraq and Syria.
Easy. I think I'll start from this, like the segue, the previous one, because I think your phrase "stabilizing force" makes sense. I don't think Syria is ready for the demise of ISIS yet. I don't think we should talk about the day after yet, because there are two things happening here. ISIS is a threat to the West in the way it's present in Syria and operates in Syria. There's no question about that. So that's a consideration. Do you keep ISIS as a governing body in Syria or not? And I think that has to be weighed against something else. And I think it's a very important one. If you expel ISIS today from Raqqa and elsewhere, it's going to open a new conflict in Syria. Many low intensity but very dangerous conflicts in these areas. That's not to say keep ISIS, but to say that the necessary forces that unfortunately Washington was not ready to engage and work with, the right forces to expel ISIS from Raqqa, from Deir ez-Zor, from eastern Aleppo. These forces are the only forces that are, if they expel ISIS and if they're trained well to fill the void. And I think this is a phrase that I will keep repeating, fill the void, because that's the only way when we talk about ISIS the day after. Filling the void is going to be the key factor for defeating ISIS. And I think in Syria, you demolish ISIS in Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor, there's going to be a massive vacuum. Who's going to fill that? The regime, the Kurds, the Arab forces. The Arab forces who are the right forces there, not because we're sectarian, not because we hate, somehow we hate the Kurds. I think the Kurds should be supported in their areas, should be backed, should be supported, and Turkey should not go after them if they operate in their areas. Also recognizing the other Kurdish forces that are legitimate actors in their areas. The Kurds who are with the Syrian opposition, who are now expelled and not allowed to go to their areas by the YPG. So I think, in that sense, I think the policy recommendation would be to really double down on preparing the right forces, Sunni Arab forces, and I'm not talking in a sectarian sense, but in a demographic sense, local forces, who are the people who would be welcome in Raqqa, would be welcome in Deir ez-Zor, and would be welcome in eastern Aleppo, some of the forces that Turkey is now supporting. In Iraq, it's a long story, because for Iraq, there are causes. There are a few factors that make you optimistic about Iraq. I think the fact that everyone is working together today to fight ISIS, the fact that some Sunnis are fed up with ISIS, and they've seen how ISIS ruled their areas and governed their areas. They don't want ISIS to go back to their areas, some of the Sunnis, not everyone. The fact that many Sunnis have been actually already already working with the Iraqi government on a local level to build and rebuild their territories, whether in Tikrit or in Fallujah and elsewhere. There are still problems, but I think there are some segments and some sectors of Sunnis are working there. Some politicians are already involved with the Iraqi government. There are still problems with what the Iraqi government, what Iraqis call rejectionists, people who reject the current system because they think it's inherently favorable to the Kurds and to the Shia. So they will always oppose it, but they are a powerful force because they can be effective disruptors to the political situation in there. And I think, according to the chief of the Hashd al-Sha'bi, or the Popular Mobilization Forces, the chief himself went to Jordan and went to Dubai in the United Arab Emirates, and he met with these rejectionists, what many call the neo-Ba'athists. And we don't know exactly what's going to happen. The National Coalition, which is a coalition of different Shia forces and Shia forces in Baghdad, they're also preparing an initiative to engage the Sunnis. But I think it's a temporary thing. It's an opportunity. I want to conclude by saying that Mosul presents a historic opportunity for Iraq to resolve and heal the wounds. But I'm not optimistic about whether Iraq is capable of doing that. But there is an opportunity that if the U.S. is really serious about resolving the Iraq problems, they can do a lot with time.
Wonderful. Well, I think I have 2 points. One, I alluded to already, that there is a huge gap between the anti-ISIS strategy and our counterterrorism strategy, which is generally how we imagine we are containing the al-Qaeda threat globally, and that gap is leaving a lot of room for the al-Qaeda movement to resurge. Al-Qaeda and ISIS, despite their differences in their competition, are actually synergistic. When one makes gains, all the ships rise, and the Salafi Jihadi movement globally is doing very well right now and is poised to do better. So our policies really do need to reconfigure our approach to al-Qaeda as we are dealing with ISIS. In Iraq, I very much agree that the threats of a rejectionist movement leave a lot of room for engagement politically. I've been looking at provincial elections upcoming as potentially a way to engage, but there are some negative indicators leading up to it that there will be intra-Sunni competition that could in fact go the other way and produce some real opportunities for mobilization against the state. In Anbar, I believe the provincial council is trying to ask the governor right now, and I think I read that the Anbar provincial court just put out an arrest warrant for al-Barisha, who is the leader of the Sahwa. So there are some big cleavages that are moving now, and so long as we are tracking them now and actually engage those issues now, I think we can help Iraq stay on a path to a positive future in the wake of ISIS controlling its cities. In Syria, I would submit that the challenge is still very much that al-Qaeda has penetrated and is on a track to succeed in leading large portions of the opposition, and that is a disincentive to engage them. But no matter how bad or how complicated that situation looks, it can always get worse. And it is getting worse because we are admiring that problem rather than engaging it more aggressively than we are. So we do actually have to defeat al-Qaeda in Syria in order to establish conditions wherein neither ISIS nor al-Qaeda will gain permanent, not only sanctuary, but genuine control of populations and land.
Great. Well, Iraq and Syria are, of course, linked, but I think they can be delinked to a certain extent. I'll start with Iraq. And I think there's grounds for hope in Iraq. Let me give some history of why we might have those grounds, and then go policy implications going forward. First, really consistently, ever since 2003 and even today, most Iraqi Arabs want a unified Iraq and see themselves as Iraqis. Right? They may identify as Sunnis or Shia, but they identify as Iraqis. Now, what the form of that unified Iraq is, a strongly federal Iraq versus some kind of decentralized Iraq, that's up for grabs. But number one, they view themselves as Iraqi. Second, in 2010 or so, when we were preparing for U.S. withdrawal, a big concern was the Kurdish Arab flashpoint. Well, it was a point, but it never flashed, right? There was small disagreements, but nothing terrible ever happened between the Kurds and the Arabs in any of the disputed territories. The third historical grounds for where accommodation could be reached is if you think back to when Kurdistan region was on its rampage with independent oil contracts, and it had the coup of giving 6 different exploration blocks to Exxon, 3 of which were in disputed territories, including in Nineveh Governorate. Well, initially, the Nineveh political class was just outraged. And then within 6 months, maybe a year, certainly less than a year, somehow they reached accommodation. Now, what happened, what Athil Jafi and Kak Massoud discussed behind closed doors, I don't know that I want to know. But there was an accommodation reached. So now going forward, there's also actually one other grounds for hope, and this sounds a little counterintuitive, which is the collapse of Iraqi finances and oil prices. Historically, we see in oil countries that when their budgets are destroyed, they institute good reforms. So the poster child of that was Mexico in 1982 after the debt crisis. Because of that, we got an independent central bank. We got a move to outward-oriented economic policies, entry into the GATT. So Iraq is facing that issue now, and it's kind of a little bit under the conservatorship of IMF and World Bank. And so there's going to be pressure on good government reforms. Now, there is a long way to go, right? This is a government that from 2005 until 2014, doubled its employment and doubled it again, and probably added to ghost employees. And it's a government that even today has done very little for real private sector development, other than saying that private sector development is important. But there have been some reforms. So that kind of, for policy implications in Iraq, that says that the international community should remain certainly engaged in the governance aspect. This is not just a counterterrorism exercise. This is an exercise of helping the Iraqis figure out the best constitutional arrangement, maybe mediating between communities, helping with legal reform. And of course, naturally, all the different groups in Iraq will have to agree to those reforms, but there needs to be quite intensive engagement this time around. The second aspect, again, drawing on history and then looking forward, and now let me draw on the terrific work by Craig Whiteside. We saw 2007 to 2013, the last time AQI and ISI were defeated, is sleeper cells remained. And it was quite a specific strategy that they followed, which was clandestine infiltration, assassination of Sahwa leaders first, and then of legitimate authorities, police and army. And during that period, there was actually very little assassination. So 2010, 2011, very few attacks against coalition forces. We were the target. The target was to undermine the legitimate Iraqi government. So policy implication number 2, again, this is not just a counterterrorism exercise. This is policing. This is policing in politics. This is making the population feel confident that they will be protected by the government. This is creating a police force and security services that don't prey on the population and that are able to monitor criminal activity. In some ways, it's an anti-mafia exercise at this point. So the police training, better internal security, very important for the future of Iraq. Right? So Iraq is simple, I think was the word. Syria, I tell you, it's really hard for all the reasons we said. You want to remove ISIS so they can't continue to raise money. And that's going to be, it's a mistake to talk about Mosul as being the last redoubt. We have the entire western Euphrates River Valley. We have Al-Qaim all the way to Deir ez-Zor. We have oil fields there, lots of good revenue-raising potential. So you want them out. Al-Qaeda is gaining strength. The rebranded, I don't know, they would claim they're not Al-Qaeda now, but I think we're all considering them to be still Al-Qaeda. They're gaining strength, and because the international community did not fully engage early on in training opposition forces, they've become an important part of those opposition forces. And the third element with Syria is I don't really think that we settle the issue as long as Assad, certainly as long as Assad is in power, and then it's debatable whether we can settle this if his regime is still in power. I'm not enough of a Syria expert to go that far. So it's actually a very tough case. And so because it's a very tough case, the international coalition is doing what it's focusing on in its interest, which is counter Islamic State, thinking about Raqqa. But that is going to breed further problems. And how we settle that, I don't have good ideas.
And I'll add one more. I mean, before we turn it over to questions, is I don't think you can unlock a lot of the things in Syria on the ground independent of the regime while you still have Turks and Kurds shooting at each other. And so the interlocking on top of this, the Turkish-Kurdish, cleavage and insurgency as well, and how that bleeds over into Turkish actions inside of Syria, you can't unlock what would make sense to probably a lot of people on this panel to try and facilitate, on local ceasefires between Arabs and Kurds, intra-Arab, intra-Kurdish cooperation on, say, joint governing of areas in conflict, while the main backer of one side will prevent that. And so you need, as the United States, to try and to expand the scope of your own responsibilities, to try and take upon what is a strand and a thread, a very long and old thread of this conflict that has actually spilled over the border into Syria, which is the PKK Turkish government fight that is actually raging at the moment. So on that happy note, and with those sort of easy policy recommendations to implement, we have about 25 minutes left, and I think it would be great if we can turn it over to the audience here for questions, with the caveat that I am the moderator, and I will use the prerogative to try and limit the questions to one or two sentences, and they actually end in a question mark. I'm sure there's a lot of things that were said about things that you're interested in, but obviously we'd like to get as many as we can. So with that, I open the floor, and yes, sir, right here. And maybe you can introduce yourself as well.
I'm Harlan Ullman with the Atlantic Council. I'd like to compliment the panel for a very, very thorough and comprehensive talk. My question is this: could you comment on the casualties that all sides are taking that we know about, coalition, civilians, Al-Qaeda, and I should say the Islamic State, and the command and control that's being used on the coalition side and the involvement of the United States? Because it seems to me that is very, very, very rickety.
You want to go first?
Certainly. I don't have good numbers on the casualties, but Iraqi forces at one point a week and a half ago were complaining about a lack of airstrikes because they were taking so many. And the way that I've metabolized that is to recognize that when there were 4 and now 5 or 6 axes of advance on the city, that's a lot of firepower heading towards Mosul at the same time, coming into a lot of enemy contact with ISIS, and that there are a lot of airstrikes being called in, and most of them are getting covered, and yet the casualties on the coalition side are still very high. ISIS is also executing a lot of suicide operations, so it is also taking a lot of casualties. I have not encountered that many reports yet of troops in contact, so these still look like explosive and either mobile or static defenses that are being run into, and I would assume ISIS therefore in fallback positions, but that ISIS is trying to move civilians as human shields and is executing those who resist. Among the people who are being executed who are resisting are retired Iraqi army officers. Whenever I hear that phrase attached to Mosul, I think Ba'athist cadre, and I think about those who might be in a position to launch an armed resistance, not only to the state but to ISIS. So the civilian and retired military demographic inside of Mosul is, I would say, of the 3, the one that is taking the most casualties. When it comes to C2 of the coalition, I was skeptical about how well the C2 would come together, and it is performing very well. So I do think the operation of Mosul has been well designed, and that all parties that are participating have signed on to it. The spoilers are not at this time the Kurdish and Iraqi force coalition elements, or even the tribal forces within the PMUs fighting alongside Shia forces. It is the independent spin-off operations, such as Talafar, that could break apart the plan.
In C2 for the audience?
Oh, command and control. Who's designing and orchestrating and leading the thing?
How about the American involvement? How do you see where we're engaged and who's in charge on our side?
So the question is American involvement, who's engaged and who's in control on our side? Well, Operation Inherent Resolve is the command I would point to. There are special forces missions, there are air component missions, and there are partner capacity building efforts. All of them are engaged. Partner capacity building forces are forward in a, I think I'm tracking the lowest echelon would be a battalion level. So I can't necessarily speak to whether or not U.S. forces are actually on the axis of advance. I don't know. But we are heavily integrated into the indigenous forces who are actually the ground elements.
Alvin, anything to add?
I just add a couple things on casualties. We should expect very high Islamic State casualties. Historically, when we look at their rosters, they continue to pay families of fighters who have been killed, and so we're able to identify from the rosters how many are killed. We saw in Anbar in 2005, 2006, about a third of them had been killed. We saw comparing Mosul rosters, Inawar rosters from 2007 and 2009 that even a higher proportion had been killed. And so they're almost expendable to their leadership. We're also seeing casualties inside Mosul from resistance movements being executed. And then we should expect some residual casualties because ISIL has been wiring cities as it leaves. And so people want to go home. And so they will, even if they're told that they shouldn't go home, they will go home, they will open a refrigerator or pick up an object, and there will be an explosion. I haven't tracked at all casualties on Iraq or other coalition forces.
I can address one aspect outside of the Iraq operation, which is Manbij, which was largely a Kurdish affair with American air power and special operations. And that, there were hundreds of Kurdish casualties there. I think the upwards about 300. The estimates are between 300 and 400, with injuries well over 1,000. It's unknown how many the Islamic State took. They don't actually advertise this. And the documents that we could use to track it will probably be out in the next 10 years, so we can look back and get a better sense. But it gives you a sense of, let's take Raqqa as sort of a model. Let's take Manbij as what Raqqa would look like, and this will not be an easy affair. And this will require a significant amount of YPG forces to do it, and then willing to take casualties as well to do it. And so when you get back to that sort of my policy recommendation, you have to solve Turkish-Kurdish grievances in addition to worry about the political tensions between Arab-Kurd, is how do you turn around and tell the YPG that you have to leave a town where you just lost a large amount of your people? And so it becomes politically problematic even if the YPG don't want to stay. They will put allies in there and then try and control the city. And not without reason, because of what we were asking them to do. So next question from the audience, sir in the back.
Hello, Andrew Flown with the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy. You spoke.
Can you speak up a little bit, sir?
You all spoke on the problems with having ISIS have actual ground control with taxation and funding their efforts, and also problems with having foreign fighters have avenues to enter Syria through. But what about the foreign funding that's involved? What do we do after ISIS is routed and defeated, after ISIS is removed from their current positions, when they still have funding? Do we expect that as the international community sees defeat, they'll lose funding complicitly, or that there will still be a funded terrorist organization with serious capabilities?
Howard, maybe you want to take it. And if I can ask you, after your answer, maybe expand upon how we can begin to train up local forces to do the things needed to counter ISIL finance.
Sure. So foreign financing is something that we really haven't had to worry about much, because they historically and even today have not raised a lot of money from foreign donors. The Al-Qaeda model, the wealthy Gulf Arabs funneling money to Afghanistan and then to Pakistan doesn't really apply to Islamic State. Now let me again refer to documents. What we saw I'll go 3 different periods. I'll start with Anbar, 2005, 2006. They're very meticulous at recording in their ledgers where their revenues come from. Approximately 5% of their revenues were marked as donations. And that didn't differentiate between foreign and domestic. So we assume those were mostly domestic. If we look at their ledgers from Mosul, the second peak of their power in Iraq and their headquarters in 2008, 2009, we get about the same proportion from donations, certainly less. And then if we fast forward to the Islamic State, 2014 to the present, we can break down their sources of revenues into money they held from banks in territories they captured. That was the largest single injection. And then oil revenues, that's local. And that's originally from smuggling out through Turkey and we think Kurdistan, but that stopped early on. And so most of their oil revenues have since come from internal sales in their own market and also collusion with the Assad regime, exchanges. So oil revenues and then taxation and extortion, and then much smaller amounts kidnapped for ransom and a sale of archaeological artifacts. Now they did get money from overseas. Fighters would bring money, and there were other scams they would use, but really compared to the bulk of their revenues, very small. So one of the questions that's been raised as we kind of think about what does the future of Islamic State look like after it's ejected from Mosul, Raqqa, Deir ez-Zor, so on, is does it then turn to foreign funders? It could always be wrong, right? Because the future, can't predict the future. But baked into their doctrine is don't raise money from foreign governments because they'll tend to control you. So my guess is that we still won't have to worry that much about foreign governments. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I mean, it's thinking from a purely kind of very cynical view, I think it is in the interests of the Gulf countries and other potential donors to make sure that whoever is donating money isn't donating to Islamic State. I mean, overtly, they are members of the Counter-ISIL Finance Group, which is a multinational group that looks at Islamic State finances. It's very hard for them to justify support for Islamic State. It's easier for them to justify support to Al-Qaeda. They can always say Al-Qaeda or Jabhat Fatah al-Sham is no longer part of Al-Qaeda. It's a legitimate part of the anti-Assad coalition, and we support that. I mean, you could see them saying that. It's much harder to see them not cooperating in the counter-ISIL fight. So I don't think we'll have a problem with foreign donations in a large scale.
I just want to agree on that. Even Al-Qaeda, even Jabhat Fatah al-Sham in Syria resist foreign support. They would say, look, I'm not going to look, you can put it in my pocket, but I'm not going to take funding from outside, because they worry a lot about infiltration, about people within Jabhat Fatah al-Sham or other groups that would be influenced by the donors and be steered by the donors. So I agree. ISIS is even more extreme on that. They do a lot of vetting for people even within the organization that have deep pockets.
Just speaking from the Turkish perspective, because of the transit border route, one of the successes of the coalition that doesn't get mentioned a lot, because a lot of us follow the military day to day, has been the counter-financing task force. And so some things that you see in Turkey, in addition to the border being cut off with Euphrates Shield, and even before that, subsequent efforts to block the border, was efforts to try and control the establishment of local bank accounts along the border to prevent, say, somebody who was a fighter to then transfer money to a local bank account, to then get that bank account, get it out of the money, and as they go across, the Islamic State takes everything from them, and so it was another potential source of revenue as well. And so it's one of the things in the coalition that doesn't get a lot of credit, but the counter-financing task force within it is quite important. Sir, right here in the front.
Thank you very much, Alexander Kravitz from Insight Iraq. Great panel. I heard Hassan Hassan talked about on schedule, and we've heard other government officials here in the U.S. talk about on schedule. And then later you talked about fighting for 4 months, if I got that right. My question is, on schedule, that assumes that there is a schedule from beginning to end. So what would be the schedule for planting the flag in Mosul? I mean, I'm just curious. We keep hearing in the press we're going on time. So what's it going to look like? And for Jessica Lewis, you mentioned Shedadi. I'm just curious, what happened after? I mean, they fled, but that was 2015. The population fled south. That was 2015. What happened later? I mean, is it still empty? Did they come back? If anything, because that might shed light into how it might play in other places. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. This is what the Iraqis and the Americans are saying. They are on schedule. It's been a little bit, I think, 2 or 3 days, more than 2 weeks into the fighting, and I think it's been, the Americans were saying most of the forces did their job on schedule, meaning the Peshmerga has reached the eastern frontier and cleared some of the important areas. The counterterrorism force, for example, was expected to have really difficult terrain along the southern frontier. But they've done a great job in that area. For example, Shura was supposed to be a very difficult, tough fight, but they took it, I think, a couple of days. They had a pause for a day or two, but they reached there. The problem is, and this relates to the problem of the casualties. I think there's a problem. There's a point to be made about transparency. And the U.S. obviously and the Iraqis want to show that this is a very clean fight, and they want to go in there as smoothly as possible, and they want to control some of the reporting. Not in the sense that they utilize the fact that the reporters cannot go so far into the front lines. So I think there's that problem that once they reach the center of Mosul, or they say they reach the center of Mosul, and they try to de-escalate or reduce the coverage, the media coverage in that area, and it seems like Mosul is going very well. I think that's a problem, because we always have to be attentive to the local dynamics and what's happening inside, whether people are agitated by the forces coming into Mosul, or they are welcoming the forces, because we've seen a lot of disinformation throughout the fight. I always don't pay attention to the numbers, because I think the U.S. exaggerates the numbers. The ISIS also does exaggerate the numbers from the other side. There is a lot of disinformation. A lot of the reporting, I could start a website just fact-checking the reporting about ISIS. There's so much already happened. There's rebellion within Mosul. That never happened. That's just a lie, because that's not how ISIS works. And also some of the reporting echoes some other reporting 2 years ago. So it seems like it's taken from one page somewhere. So I think always take this reporting with a pinch of salt. But I think so far, so good.
My answer is actually fairly short. It's a wonderful question, what's happened in Shadadi over the course of the last year, and I actually haven't looked. But for exactly the reason that you framed, that it could tell us about how the situation will play out a year later, I'm going to go do so, and I would be happy to share with you my findings.
Anything to add on Shadadi? I don't have the answer to that either. Does anybody have a question? I saw your hand shoot up in the back corner. In the back corner, behind the column. There you go. Caught my eye.
Hi, my name is Mohammed Ahmad, and I am with the Arab American Institute. My question is, currently there is a record of about 64 million refugees worldwide, with a significant portion coming from Syria and Iraq. How should the international community support Iraq and Syria and neighboring states, including Lebanon and Jordan, in achieving stability with a high number of refugees after ISIS is defeated?
That's a great question. Does anybody have thoughts on the refugee issue?
I'll go ahead. That's a great question. It's a very difficult question. Let me throw out some ideas. I don't think there's one coherent answer. There's been an enormous, so let's start going stages from kind of immediate assistance to longer range. Immediate assistance, there's a lot of pressure on Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, especially the main receiving countries, and they didn't ask for this burden. They happen to be in the neighborhood and they received the burden. So for the immediate, I think international assistance in terms of shelter, food, especially schools, education for children is merited. And I don't think that international assistance has been at the level that it should be. And we can be very cold and say, well, the adults, it's kind of too bad what happened to them. But we have an entire generation of young Middle Easterners who could be the doctors, engineers, and artists of tomorrow, and are instead the refugees of today with a very uncertain tomorrow. So that's the immediate issue. Second, I'm going to assume, based on fact, that most refugees want to go home. But we also know that refugees tend to stay refugees for much longer than they think they will. So now we face a difficult issue, which is that do we try to help Jordan and Lebanon and Turkey integrate those refugees, kind of make sure they have work permits, allow them to fully take part in society? That would be very good for the refugees. It could be in the long run, or even medium run, good for those economies because they have more workers, especially young people, so it could be good for growth, but at the same time you have cultural issues and social issues. And so that kind of is one decision point we have to consider. If we don't help them integrate, then the question is, where do they go? Well, Europe has decided it's had enough, at least it's had enough this quickly, and the United States is slowly taking the Middle Eastern refugees. We take other refugees. So that kind of is a dilemma. The only other option for them is to speed to bring stability and security back to their home regions, and so that is somewhat happening in Iraq. That goes back to the policy implications that I said in Iraq, right? Better governance, reconstruction. The IDPs and refugees, most of them will tend to go back if they haven't been away for too long. Syria, I think if you want to put it in those humanitarian terms, we have a very strong argument for greater international involvement in the war, to the extent that it can bring stability to parts of Syria. It's going to be very hard to put Syria back together. So the question is, are there areas that we can stabilize in Syria? More cooperation with Arab forces, Arab opposition forces, more cooperation with the Kurds that we can stabilize that people would want to go back to. And so I think, that's way above all of our pay grades, I think. But those are the dilemmas that governments have to look at with them. So I just talked about that Middle Eastern refugees. I didn't talk about the other 50 million. Is it 10 million displaced from Syria, 3 to 4 million displaced in Iraq? That's enough to deal with for now.
If I could just add something quickly. This seems to be a very interesting week in terms of refocusing that question of refugees, particularly from Syria. I want to point to two items. One, that I believe Lebanon has new political leadership this week, and the feeling about Syrian refugees is quite contrary to the very constructive argument that you just made about options that could be pursued to their benefit within their adopted countries. I think Lebanon is very much headed in a direction right now that could make that problem more acute. So I'm refocusing right now actually upon regional hubs where refugees are collecting, and less upon Europe, which I had been focusing in recent months. The other place where I would point is actually Morocco. Morocco is having a weird protest movement right now that I think also speaks to the fact that one of the original arteries for Syrian refugees escaping was actually to Algeria, and from Algeria, where they couldn't stay on their visas from Syria, which were generally easy to get, they just went to Morocco. So those are two places where the refugee issue that has sort of been stable is becoming unstable, and I therefore just want to highlight that there can potentially be more than just a broad brush statement about how to help them, though I very much agree getting them back to a vital position in their home countries is the ideal. I think in the immediate term we actually are going to have to deal with some places we haven't been talking about lately.
And I think with the final question, I know you've been very patient, and then we can begin to wrap up because we have about 5 minutes left. Okay, so the final question from this woman right here.
Thank you. So my question is about Al-Qaeda's movements. Traditionally, Zawahiri and his predecessor bin Laden were mostly focused on the establishment of a state, a caliphate, as a distant promise, a unifying force for Al-Qaeda's ultimate goal, which was some kind of globalized insurgency movement. So given a recent movement in Syria, is that changing? Is Al-Qaeda trying to become more of a sort of Zarqawi model of sort of state presence, ethno-sectarian conflicts? How is what are Al-Qaeda's ultimate goals in the Syrian conflict?
As I said, we have about 4 minutes, so and I'll wrap up. So.
I think Jabhat Fath al-Sham in Syria, so they abandoned Al-Qaeda name, at least in public. They still have the philosophy of Al-Qaeda, the original one, which is that their mission is to popularize the idea of jihad. You need to normalize and embed within the community and encourage people to join jihad rather than enforce some sort of governing body on them. So they rely a lot. They focus a lot on consensus. Unlike Al-Qaeda, unlike ISIS and Zarqawi. Although the idea of a state and how the Zarqawis pursued it in Iraq actually goes back to a letter sent by Ayman al-Zawahiri to Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi in 2006 when he congratulated him on the formation of the Mujahideen Shura Council, which was an Al-Qaeda group joining other Iraqi forces to look more Iraqi. And he said the steps should be to establish a state in the Sunni areas in Iraq, and that could develop into a caliphate, and then you expand the jihadi wave, in his words, into secular countries around the region, and then after that, confrontation with Israel. So the 4 steps that Zawahiri laid out were pursued by ISIS. So I think Jabhat al-Nusra still is a hybrid between the two, that they want to establish some sort of governing body, but they don't want to establish a state yet.
I think just adding 2 points. First, it is interesting to me that Zawahiri has lately put out a statement directed at members of ISIS who might cleave towards Al-Qaeda as ISIS loses strength. That Zarqawi was fabulous. It was a very pro-Zarqawi message, really capturing the idea that Iraqis can be part of Al-Qaeda again. So just to juxtapose those two in relationship, that is how Zawahiri is handling the legacy of Zarqawi now, that playing upon the fact that he had been a part of Al-Qaeda's movement. The other, just reinforcing, Al-Qaeda does not imagine itself to be the governing entity. It imagines itself to be the silent vanguard. But its affiliates, by another name, can be governing entities. Right. So it would be consistent with Zawahiri's current program for an affiliate that doesn't bear the Al-Qaeda name to govern. And I do think that's ultimately the direction in which Jaish Fatah al-Sham will head.
So I think with that, we ended right on time, so everybody can get back to work today, including us. So I want to thank the panelists. Please join me in thanking them, and thank you everybody for attending. That's the middle.
Republicans are meeting on Capitol Hill today to discuss how they're going to proceed under a joint Republican government.